In the spring of 1834, a clerk named Thomas Westervelt was hired to assist with the organization of the Astor estate's land records at the family's counting house on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan. Westervelt had been employed by a city records firm for 11 years and had organized the property documentation of some of the largest landholders in New York. He had never encountered anything like what he found at the Astor counting house. The records that existed were meticulous, current, and comprehensive for everything after approximately 1800. Before 1800, the documentation of how John Jacob Astor had acquired the properties that formed the foundation of the estate was not meticulous. It was not comprehensive. In many cases, it was not there at all. Westervelt noted the gap in a letter to his employer, a man named Cornelius Day, who ran the records firm. He described specific parcels, significant land holdings in what is now Midtown Manhattan, in Greenwich Village, and along the western shore of the island, for which the acquisition documentation in the Astor files did not establish a traceable chain of title from a prior owner to John Jacob Astor. The parcels were listed as Astor property. They were generating rents. They were being managed and taxed as part of the estate, but the records showing how they had come to be Astor property, and when, and from whom, were either absent, incomplete, or described transactions that Westervelt found, in his professional judgment, to be unusual in ways he did not specify further in the letter. He did not pursue the matter. Westervelt was a clerk, not an investigator, and his employer's business was records organization, not records investigation. He completed the assignment, filed the letter with Day, and moved on to the next engagement. The letter is in the New York Historical Society archive in a miscellaneous correspondence collection donated by the Day family estate in 1912. It has been catalogued since 1934. It has been cited once in a footnote in a 1967 academic study of New York property records in the early national period. The footnote describes it as an interesting administrative note without significance to the study's primary argument. What Westervelt had noticed in 1834 was the same gap that has troubled every serious historian of the Astor fortune who has worked from primary sources rather than from the family-authorized accounts that form the basis of the standard biography. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand why the origin of the Astor fortune is a problem for the historical record rather than a settled question, we have to start with what the documented facts of John Jacob Astor's early life actually show, and where the documentation simply stops. John Jacob Astor arrived in Baltimore in March of 784. He was 20 years old, the son of a butcher in Waldorf, a small village in what is now southwestern Germany. He had approximately $25 cash, by his own later account. He spoke limited English. He had no documented connections to anyone of wealth or influence in the United States, Britain, or continental Europe. He had no prior business experience beyond helping his older brother run a small musical instrument shop in London, where he had spent several years before emigrating. These facts come from Astor's own recollections, recorded in conversations with the journalist James Parton in the 1850s, and from the scattered documentation of his earliest years in New York that has survived in city records, church registers, and the correspondence of contemporaries. By 1800, 16 years after arriving with $25, John Jacob Astor was one of the largest landowners in Manhattan, with a fur trading operation that was already generating profits that placed him among the wealthiest men in the country, and with political connections at the highest levels of the new American Republic. By 1820, he was almost certainly the wealthiest man in America. By his death in 1848, his estate was valued at approximately $20 million, equivalent to roughly $700 million in current value, making it by far the largest private fortune accumulated in the United States to that point. The accumulation in the first 16 years is the problem. Not because rapid wealth accumulation is impossible, it is not, but because the documented record of how it occurred does not cohere. The pieces that exist do not fit together into a coherent explanation of how a 20-year-old German immigrant with $25 became a Manhattan land baron and international trading magnate within 16 years without a documented source of initial capital, without a documented business partner who provided that capital, and without a documented account from any contemporary of how it happened. The numbers make the timeline problem concrete. Astor's earliest documented New York real estate purchase was in 1789, 5 years after his arrival. The purchase price is recorded. It was not a small sum. It was not the kind of purchase a man making modest income from a music instrument shop and small fur trading could comfortably finance. Between 1789 and 1800, Astor made a series of real estate purchases that, taken together, established the land base that the Astor fortune would ultimately rest on. Those purchases are documented in the city property records. The prices paid are recorded, the sellers are named. What is not documented is where the money came from. In several of the transactions, the property records show Astor acquiring parcels at prices that required more liquid capital than his documented income sources could account for. The gap between what the income record shows and what the purchase record shows is not a matter of imprecision in historical accounting. It is a structural discrepancy that every serious researcher who has examined the primary sources has noted and none has resolved. The fur trading operation is the piece of the story that receives the most attention in the standard accounts of Astor's rise, and the attention is warranted. Astor built a genuine fur trading empire that was, by the early 1800s, the dominant force in the North American fur trade. The American Fur Company, which he chartered in 1808, eventually controlled the trade across most of the continent. Its operations were real, its records survive in substantial detail, and its profits were enormous. But the fur trading empire was built on a capital base whose origins are not documented. The fur trade required capital to buy pelts, to transport them, to maintain trading relationships, to extend credit. The capital that funded Astor's entry into the fur trade at a scale that allowed him to grow as fast as he did has no documented source. His earliest purchases of New York real estate, purchases that established the land base from which the Astor fortune ultimately derived most of its value, predate the fur trading profits that could plausibly have funded them. A financial historian named John Dennis Hager, whose 1991 study John Jacob Astor, Business and Finance in the Early Republic, represents the most rigorous scholarly examination of Astor's financial career, acknowledges directly in that study that the early capital question is unresolved. Hager describes the documentation of Astor's earliest financial activities as fragmentary, notes that the surviving records do not establish a clear picture of where the capital for his initial real estate acquisitions came from, and concludes that the question may be unanswerable given the state of the surviving evidence. Hager's book is the standard academic reference on Astor's finances. It is the work that subsequent historians cite when they discuss the Astor fortune. Its conclusion that the origin of the initial capital is unresolvable from the surviving evidence has been accepted by the field as a settled matter rather than as a continuing research problem. That acceptance is itself interesting. In most fields, a significant documented gap in the evidence for a major historical claim would be classified as an open research question requiring continued investigation. In the academic history of American business and wealth, the Astor capital origin question has been classified as closed, not because it has been answered, but because the leading scholar in the field declared it unanswerable and the field accepted that declaration. The classification as unanswerable serves a specific institutional function. It removes the question from the active research agenda. A question classified as unanswerable does not receive funding for archival investigation. It does not generate graduate dissertations. It does not attract the sustained attention of researchers who might find, in archives not yet examined, evidence that changes the picture. The unanswerable classification is the academic equivalent of the institutional silence that characterizes the suppression pattern in every other story in this series. The records are not gone. The question has simply been declared closed before the full range of relevant archives has been examined That acceptance is itself interesting. A gap in the documentation of one of the largest private fortunes accumulated in American history, a gap in the period most relevant to understanding how the fortune began, has been classified as an unanswerable historical question rather than as a question whose answer might exist in records that have not yet been found or in archives that have not yet been fully examined. Astor's political connections in the early years of the Republic are documented with more clarity than his financial origins, and they are connections that raise their own questions about the standard account. By 1786, 2 years after his arrival, Astor had established contact with Alexander Hamilton, then practicing law in New York and serving as one of the central architects of the new federal financial system. By 1790, Astor had connections to Robert Morris, the Philadelphia merchant and financier who had served as superintendent of finance during the Revolutionary War and who was the most powerful financial figure in the early Republic. By 1800, Astor was in regular correspondence with Governor DeWitt Clinton and had connections extending to the highest levels of the Jefferson administration. These connections were not typical of a 20-year-old immigrant who had arrived 6 years earlier with $25. They were connections that implied either extraordinary personal talent for cultivating powerful relationships or an introduction to those relationships that the official record does not document. The speed with which Astor cultivated those political relationships in the 1780s and 1790s is not explainable by the official account of his background. Alexander Hamilton did not extend his social and professional attention to every recent immigrant who showed up in New York with a modest fur trading business. Robert Morris, whose financial network was the most extensive in the early Republic, did not take business meetings with men who had no established capital or connections. The access Astor had to these men in his first decade in America implies that he was introduced to them by someone with a standing to make that introduction, or that he arrived with some credential or connection that his official biography does not record. Both possibilities point to something in the pre-American period of his life, in London or in Germany, or in the networks that connected European commerce to the new American Republic, that the surviving record does not illuminate. The 3 years in London before emigration are the obvious candidate. They are the least documented period of his life. The connection between what happened in London between 1781 and 1784 and what happened in New York between 1784 and 1800 has never been established from primary sources, and the primary sources that would establish it have either not survived or have not been found. The British connection is the most persistent gap. Astor spent 3 years in London before emigrating, working for his brother's musical instrument business. That period of his life is the least documented of any in the surviving record. His brother George, who ran the London business, was a successful merchant with commercial connections that extended beyond musical instruments into trade more broadly. What those connections were, who they involved, and what, if anything, they meant for John Jacob's subsequent success in America is not established by any surviving document. Several historians have noted that Astor's fur trading operation from its earliest years had a remarkably sophisticated relationship with British trading networks, relationships that gave him access to markets and credit that his ostensible position as a recent immigrant with limited capital should not have permitted. Those relationships imply prior connections. The prior connections are not documented. One specific figure in the British connection has attracted the attention of researchers without producing a resolution, a merchant named John Ebbets, who appears in New York commercial records beginning in the early 1790s and who had documented connections to London trading houses, was a regular business associate of Astor's in his earliest New York years. Ebbets' own origins are as poorly documented as Astor's. He appears in the New York records fully formed, with capital and connections, without a traceable prior career. He and Astor conducted transactions together in the period when Astor's real estate accumulation was most rapid. The nature of those transactions, whether Ebbets was a source of capital, a conduit for British trading credit, or simply a business associate, is not established by any surviving document. Ebbets disappears from the New York commercial record in the early 1800s as completely as he appeared in the 1790s. There is no death record in New York that matches him. There is no further commercial record after approximately 1803. He is, in the documentary record, a figure who was present during the period when the Astor Fortunes foundations were laid, and then ceased to exist as a documented individual. The coincidence of his appearance and disappearance with the critical period of Astor's accumulation has been noted. It has not been investigated. A researcher named Gustavus Myers, who spent years in the early 20th century examining the origins of large American fortunes and published his findings in 1909 under the title History of the Great American Fortunes, devoted a chapter to the Astor fortune and described the documentary gap in terms that the subsequent century of more academically credentialed scholarship has confirmed without resolving. Myers was a muckraking journalist rather than a trained historian, and the academic establishment has tended to treat his work as polemical rather than scholarly. But the specific observations he made about the documentary record of the Astor fortune's origins, the absence of traceable capital sources, the unusually well-connected relationships for a man of his ostensible background, the real estate acquisitions that preceded the profits that could have funded them, have been confirmed by the academic research conducted since his time, including Hager's 1991 study. Myers did not know what the answer was, neither did Hager. Neither does anyone who has worked seriously with the surviving primary sources. The New York City property records for the period between 1784 and 1800 are held at the Municipal Archives on Chambers Street. They are accessible to researchers. They document property transfers, tax assessments, and ownership records for the period of Astor's initial land accumulation. The records have been examined by researchers studying New York property history, a systematic analysis of all Astor property acquisitions in that period, tracing each parcel back through its chain of title and documenting the price paid, the seller, the date, and the source of funds used, has not been published as a formal study. The Astor estate's own records from the same period are held in part at the New York Public Library, which the Astor family funded. The pre-1800 holdings in that collection are sparse. The family itself has acknowledged that the earliest records of the estate are incomplete. No explanation has been offered for why the records of the fortune's founding years are less complete than the records of every subsequent period. The standard account of the Astor fortune tells us that John Jacob Astor was an exceptionally talented and energetic immigrant who built his wealth through hard work, sharp trading instincts, and an early recognition of the value of Manhattan real estate. That account is not wrong about Astor's intelligence, his energy, or the real estate insight. What it cannot explain, from the surviving documentary record, is where the initial capital came from, why a 20-year-old German immigrant with $25 had established relationships with Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris within 6 years of arriving, or why the acquisition records for his most significant early property holdings are incomplete in ways that a clerk organizing those records in 1834 noticed and noted in writing. The New York Historical Society Archive, the Municipal Archives on Chambers Street, the New York Public Library's Astor collection. The records are there in fragments, accessible to researchers who know where to look. What they show, collectively, is not a settled origin story. They show the outline of an origin story that the surviving documents do not fill in, a gap where the explanation should be, acknowledged by the most rigorous historian who examined it, and classified as unanswerable rather than as unasked. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the undocumented early capital in Astor's real estate acquisitions to a specific series of land grants issued by the New York state government between 1785 and 1795 that transferred significant portions of former Loyalist confiscated land to private buyers at prices that contemporary observers described as dramatically below assessed value. 3 of those transactions involved buyers whose names do not appear in any other documented record of New York commercial life before or after the transactions. One of the parcels transferred in those transactions appears in the Astor estate records of 1800 as Astor property, with no acquisition documentation in the file.